Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
Hey everyone, it's Igor and Ryan here for Project Uproar, and we have another very special guest, and I'll let Ryan introduce him.
So today we have Gavin Edwards on the program. Gavin is a New York Times bestselling author of 11 books, including The Tao of Bill Murray, The World According to Tom Hanks, and Excuse Me While I Kiss This Guy. A longtime contributor to Rolling Stone magazine, he has written for Wired, New York Times, Billboard, Details, and GQ. His most recent book, Kindness and Wonder, Why Mr. Rogers Matters Now More Than Ever, focuses on the life of Fred Rogers and why the lessons he conveyed on his show and in his life are relevant today. So Gavin, welcome to Project Uproar.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. So we were both very interested in your Mr. Rogers book. Particularly, we saw the film Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood a few months ago. And I know myself, I hadn't thought about Mr. Rogers in years. And after watching that movie, I found it was really transformative and really got me to think about my own life. So I'm curious about yourself. Why did you decide to write a book about Mr. Rogers? And was the book perhaps a response to our current culture?
So, I actually, it's Tom Hanks who led me to the subject, because the major book I did before was about sort of Tom Hanks, and the people I've written biographies on, I look for people who are not just performers who I admire, who are good at their jobs of acting or what have you, but who seem to have like a distinct philosophy of life that is hopefully they manifest it both in their work and in the way that they live their lives. And Bill Murray absolutely has that. He's the antic guy who will crash your party and steal a golf cart and come to your house and wash your dishes and then leave. And Tom Hanks has this, core sense of all-American decency that really animates everything that he does. But some performers you find admirable, just they're just performers. But when I heard that Tom was doing a movie on Mr. Rogers, I said, "Oh, of course." He completely fits this. He has this, innate core of, caring for children and an approach to the world that is, as I'm sure you saw in the movie, just sorely needed right now. And so I said he would be a wonderful person to immerse myself in for a while. I wasn't primarily motivated at the beginning by, I'm going to do something about the larger culture, but I was very happy that it felt like it was a counterpoint to what's going on in the world. That it feels like, gradually and then quickly the world gets kind of louder and dumber and meaner, and I can't change that single-handedly, but if I inspire people to make even the corners of the world they're in 3% better, then I think I'll be very, very happy, and the book will have done what I wanted.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I think in your book, it's not like we were reading a self-help book that was trying to be preachy. You're trying to illustrate the example of Mr. Rogers and have that as an illustration to get us to reflect on what is not happening in our own culture. So that's something that showing the example of someone is, I think, an effective way to show that message.
Yeah, I agree. And especially in this busy time where almost everything seems to be happening so fast, Mr. Rogers really seems to slow it down in a really positive way.
One of the most amazing moments on his show ever was he filled up a fish tank. And it was just, 3+ minutes of, he didn't, bring on the dancing pandas. He didn't say, we'll come back to this. He was just very comfortable with, we're going to, sit here and silently watch this happen for a while. And, just trusted that, the silence was kind of a gift and that it was going to be calming rather than infuriating for children. And so part of what I do in the book is that, the first half is, a biography of Fred Rogers, here's what he did and laying it out. But then the second half is really, it's 10 ways to be more like Mr. Rogers right now and trying to distill the wisdom of how he approached the world so that people have some stuff that they can take away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we discussed on this podcast the topic of unconventional career paths. Do you think you can talk about how Fred Rogers made the journey from a music graduate to children's entertainer, and maybe how you kind of stumbled upon your own path?
Sure. Well, let's talk about Fred first, and then we can sort of see if I won't be as interesting, but I'll do what I can.
Yeah.
So he was Fred Rogers, and by the way, I will say that it took me a while to get used to the idea of calling him Fred, even though he encouraged everyone to do it. I'm like, he's Mr. Rogers. It seems weird and particularly casual and informal, but I think he thought of everyone as his friends, and he wanted his friends to call him Fred. So he was, sort of a classic, bright but all over the place in his youth. He was sort of like very gifted at foreign languages. He was very good at music. He took flying lessons. So he was a licensed pilot, and he sort of. I don't think he had any sense of what all of that added up to. He was when he graduated from college, he was thinking, maybe I'll go into the seminary, maybe I'll go into the diplomatic corps, maybe I'll become a pilot. And then he came home one day, and his family had one of the first televisions in town. And he turned it on in the afternoon, and he saw sort of the children's entertainment, which was sort of like a slapstick show with people putting pies in each other's faces, and he was just horrified by that. He said, "This is this powerful medium, and it could be used to do so much, and this is what we're seeing." And he marched into the dining room that evening and said, "I want to go into television." And his parents were a little befuddled by this. They had just gotten used to the idea that he was going to maybe be going into the seminary, but it was this gift that he had, that he saw the potential of the medium, even though it was sort of just in its early days then, and he knew he could do something with it. And so he got a job at NBC in New York, and he spent a few years like a gopher and a floor producer. And then a couple of years later, moved back to Pittsburgh when there was a public TV station opening there. And again, had the vision to say, I'm on a good career path here, but if I go back to this, understaffed, shoestring budget station, they're going to be so desperate to put things on the air that I'll get to do a show that I want to do.
Very interesting. And do you think today that cartoons have made progress? Do you think Mr. Rogers would be glad seeing what some of the cartoons are like now, or not even cartoons, but children's programming?
He was very, very particular about what he thought of other shows, and he was, as you know, a sort of generous, kind-hearted person, but so he tried to not run down other people in public, but he was horrified by some of what he saw. I remember that when the Teletubbies were new, just the very notion that that children that young would be watching TV, and that the TV would be anthropomorphized like that. He just found horrifying. He thought very highly of Bob Keeshan, who did Captain Kangaroo, and that was on commercial TV, but he sort of could see that Keeshan really cared for children, and they actually got together on the phone once a year. Every year on New Year's Day, they would phone each other and have a conversation and catch up on how their year had gone.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. And part 2 of your book, so I know part 1, you're talking more about the bio of Mr. Rogers. Part 2, you're focusing on the 10 ways to live more like Mr. Rogers. I'm wondering, how has Mr. Rogers' example changed the way you live your life?
Well, so the number one piece of advice that Mr. Rogers gave is sort of the foundation of everything else. And I mean, some of the precepts, they sound, they're very simple in summary, but, sort of it's living up to them every day that's difficult. Sort of be kind to strangers, tell the truth, connect with other people any way you can. But the cornerstone of all of it is be deep and simple. Mr. Rogers would say, I feel like deep and simple is so much more important than complex and shallow. And we live in a complex but shallow era, right? Sort of and part of it, you can point to technology and, sort of internet and Twitter, and everybody's got everything on their phone, and you never have to, like, be distracted for more, be bored for more than 3 seconds because there's always a distraction waiting for you. I always had that type of personality that, sort of, even before the rise of the net and apps, I was the kind of guy who would be reading 6 books at once, like, hey, I'll read this for 8 pages, and then I'll get a little bored, and I'll put it down and read something else. So in many ways, this is the hardest, sort of like teaching of Fred Rogers for me to live up to, but I've found that it's also the most rewarding. The times that I spend when I sort of really focus on one thing, whether that's, sort of like spending months writing a book instead of, like flitting around in like short attention span theater, or the times I spend, just sort of like being with my family and paying attention to like the people around me in like a deeper and more focused way, and, sort of like in the neighborhood that I'm in. Those are when I get the most like fundamentally rewarding things in my life. And so it's a hard lesson for me to internalize, but I think it's also been the most rewarding lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that was like one change definitely that I think we can all relate to. We could always use more, simple and deep, because I feel like a lot of the times it's difficult to, put things in such a simple way and yet actually strike a chord with people. And I would like to know, what other advice do you think you would give to your 20-year-old self?
Oh, I mean, when you're 20 years old, you're trying to just sort of like figure it all out, right? Like, it's funny. It's two. Fred Rogers gave advice basically those 6-year-olds roughly, and sort of children like just before kindergarten, when the world seems sort of like really big and confusing, and there's a lot of things you don't understand about like whether it's the things you see on TV or how a crayon's made, or just sort of like why do people argue, or why do like parents get divorced sometimes, and like really heavy stuff. And that's an age where, and he did it in like a language that children that age really can understand. And like when you're 20, you're on the cusp of something else. It's sort of like, you're on the edge of being an adult, and you're sort of, for many people, you're maybe like moving out of your parents' house, you're finishing up college. And so looking back then, I think I needed, sort of, it was a confusing time. And I think I probably just need the reassurance it's going to be okay. That, sort of like, and to be reminded that, you're going to go off and like have these adventures, and the things you're worried about, like, sort of, like, am I going to be able to succeed as a writer? So I'm like, I don't need specific advice on that. That'll work out fine. But I think the best thing I could have told my 20-year-old self is, don't worry, it's going to be all right.
I really like that.
Yeah, I like that as well, because I found myself, I'm early in my career as a teacher, and I know a big thing Mr. Rogers talked about was the idea that it's okay to feel certain ways, and it's okay to express when we're feeling down or feeling not that confident. And myself, being new to the profession, I find I don't want to show that vulnerability when it comes to talking to different coworkers, that, hey, I don't know what I'm going to do today, and hey, I need some help with my class. And I remember when I first started, I was just like, I'm just going to solve all this on my own and not show any sort of weakness. And I think what Mr. Rogers allows or taught me to do was to be like, yeah, it's okay to feel how I feel. It's okay to feel like I'm having trouble with this job.
Yeah, and that not opening the tent or not closing the tent successfully, that one scene was perfect for that, because he's showing, he doesn't have it all figured out. He's trying like everyone else. Yeah, definitely.
One of my favorite moments that I found out about is Mr. Rogers was on a cross-country flight, and there was like a little girl in front of him, and 8 maybe, and she was flying all by herself, and she was very, very nervous. Apparently, like her father was afraid of flying, and like that sort of rubbed off on her, and so and so the flight attendants keep coming around and keep trying to like tell her, "Oh, you've got nothing to worry about. Don't be afraid." And what he does instead is he writes her a little note in which he says, "It's perfectly all right to be afraid if you want to be. However you feel is totally all right. But if you want to come back here and talk to me about it, I'd be happy to talk." And so, and I think that's just like such an important thing, like not to deny how you're feeling, but just like to know that if you can sort of like describe it and get your arms around it, it's going to feel manageable. And there's other people in the world who's going to want to help you. And it sounds like that's what happened at your school. Like, if you're sort of keeping it to yourself, then saying I'm not supposed to feel this way, then it's just going to eat away at you. But if you, say, hey, this is how I feel right now, you can be like, the generosity of other people can be constantly amazing.
For sure. Another question I kind of have for you. I'm fascinated by the way Fred Rogers spoke. Like he spoke very deliberately. He wanted to convey messages that weren't like prescriptive, like do this. I'm curious if you're like a parent. I'm not a parent yet, but if you're a parent trying to tell your kid to clean your room, right, the traditional message, how would like a Fred Rogers way of framing that message look like? Like he was very much, I read this article a while back about how he was very deliberate in the way he spoke. So how would he try to like convey a command to either his audience or someone who's young?
When he's doing it to his audience, I think it was much more sort of explaining why you don't do this. That like he wouldn't just say like don't go play in the street. He would just sort of like talk about when you're crossing the street, make sure there's adults and he would always sort of try to give as much context as possible. And this is what made him such like an amazing communicator. It also is what I think made it hard for him to like give direct orders. Sort of like at home, they had two young boys, and when it came down to like sort of I think laying down the law and saying it's time to go clean your room, I think Joanne, his wife, their mother, ended up having to do a lot of that. At the show, he was not the guy who would want to say, "Hey, that's not working out. We're going to have to do it again." He relied on the fact that he had a staff that was sensitive to his moods and his needs, and so if they saw like he wasn't happy with how it was going, they would preemptively do it for him. He really didn't like to be, sort of, this is the way it is, but went against a lot of his precepts, but he also set up situations for himself where the message was able to get across without him having to be the one who said it.
So it's important to have that Joanne figure as well. That's definitely interesting duo that they had going on. I wanted to ask, so me and Ryan are interested in writing, and we were wondering what you know about Mr. Rogers' writing process and about your own writing process and what that looks like.
I'm happy to answer this question, but tell me a little bit about your personal interest in writing. Do you guys want to collaborate on something? Are you both separately interested in it? Tell me where you're coming from.
Definitely. So I personally write a lot of scripts. We're both coming from a situation where we did undergrad in English and then teachers college in English and then masters in English, right? So we've been writing essays for a long time. Ryan has published some articles in academic school-based magazines. And I've been writing scripts about anime, actually, which is like Japanese cartoons. I have another YouTube channel about that, and that's my main job. So I write scripts on that, but I also am interested in also hopefully one day publishing a book as well. And we talked about working together on articles and stuff like that. And it's, but just wanted to say it's also we're interested in kind of self-development writing. So exactly kind of how you said 10 ways we can be more like Mr. Rogers and improve our lives that way. Me and Ryan are very much interested in those kinds of topics.
Right. So, I mean, let me talk about his writing first, I guess, and then we can sort of segue into what I do, which is not completely dissimilar. So one of the things about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was that it was scripted. That sort of the vast majority of the children's shows at that time were sort of like variety hours, essentially, and the hosts would like improvise and vamp their way through it. Sort of like, hey, we've got a guest, we're going to like sort of ask them questions, we'll do a little skit, things will work out. And in fact, before we started Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Fred was the producer on a show called The Children's Corner, where the host was this woman, Josie Carey, and it was exactly that type of show. It sort of had many of the early. It planted many of the early seeds for the neighborhood. Like, for example, like a lot of the puppets made their debut on that show. But basically, they would have a couple hours to fill every day, and Josie would go in front of the camera and talk off the top of her head. She was charming, and people loved it. But when people tried to improvise on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it would get squashed really quickly. He very much believed, we have a script, we've worked hard on the script, and the children who are watching deserve to have these thoughts expressed in the sort of like best way possible. So we're not speaking off the cuff. That sort of like every inch of it has been gone over. So even things like Henrietta Pussycat, would say, like meow meow meow, like you too, meow meow, Mr. Rogers. And I've seen like the draft he's done where it's like, oh no, that's one meow too many, and he would take it out. Like he would have these teal felt tip pens which he used to edit everything up. So he wrote most of the scripts himself. Some of them he would have staffers do that he revised, but and basically every summer. He would go away to like the family vacation home in Cape Cod, and during the summer he would be working most of the time. He would just sort of like have legal pads, and he would sort of build them up with drafts, and then they would get typed up, and he would just sort of like revise over and over. So like it's the old maxim that sort of writing is rewriting. You can have sort of like the impulse, and you can know what you want to get across, and that's really important. Sort of like. If you don't know where you're headed, you're just going to be sort of flailing around. But he was very much a believer in, you sort of go over it and over it and over it, and you communicate as well as you can. And if it's not connecting with somebody, then you find another way to do it. But just he was very big on revision. And I'm a very structure-oriented writer in the same way. That almost all of the writing he did was for a show and the songs for it. So he knew sort of the format there. That sort of not only it's a half-hour show, but that sort of every show sort of like introduces an issue sort of like in his living room. And then they go to the neighborhood of make-believe, and sort of they deal with sort of like the dream logic version of it, and then they're able to like come back to his living room and talk about it, and, sort of like process like what we learned from it. So like it's a sturdy, solid structure, and a lot of the writing that I learned to do was just sort of like 1,200 word magazine articles, and I did enough of those where I was writing about other people, and I just sort of like internalized the rhythm of that like I know what that feels like, I know how to put it together, and a lot of the pleasure that I take in writing things is when I know I've used every word sort of like just right, and it all fits together. There was a point when I used to write these capsule, tiny record reviews, like 125 words for Rolling Stone, and I used to say that it's just enough room for one opinion, one observation, and one joke. And but I loved sort of like, okay, like I might have like those things floating around, but then just sort of like approaching like the craft of like getting all of them all to like fit into place, almost like like a really complicated crossword puzzle is like where I really take delight in writing.
Very cool, very interesting.
Yeah, and I'm curious. How do you pick the individuals to write about in your book? Like you kind of mentioned a little bit before about Bill Murray and Tom Hanks, but what kind of criteria do you set to choose the people that you want to write about?
So, I mean, it needs to be, I mean, part of it is the market realities of it. That, sort of like I can't write about just sort of anybody that I care about because there has to be enough people interested in buying the book. But within that fairly wide circle, it also has to be somebody whose world I want to spend time in for a year. Sometimes I'll sort of like start investigating somebody and I'll discover just, like, seems like there's sort of miserable, unhappy person, and sort of like the notion of sort of like going through what they've done is just going to be, I think, not rewarding for me as a writer, and then not rewarding for the people as a reader. Not that everything has to be sort of like uplifting and sunshine, but that if someone is just kind of like spends their life marinating in their own unhappiness, I find that just sort of like an emotionally limiting place to me.
I completely understand that. Yeah. What of for the other kind of figures you've chosen, and I'm sure some of them are your role models in some ways. What are some of the most interesting life lessons you've taken from their lives?
Well, when I did the Bill Murray book, I think that it just really taught me a lot about spontaneity. That so much of what he does is just trying to sort of like jolt people out of sleepwalking. That sort of like the things like visit somebody in an office and says I'm going to go get some popcorn, and then like goes down to the street and like buys a popcorn machine from like a vendor, just gives them like I don't know $500, says I'll take the whole thing, and then like walks around the office handing it out to people, and he does that like because he can, and because he sees when he does that, sort of like he's put like somebody's day at like a 90-degree angle, and like for a moment they're not in the routine and like it's gone somewhere else. And I really, discovered like as a parent that sort of kids are chaos machines in a lot of ways, and so it really got me to like embrace that aspect of parenthood, to say that sort of like things are going to be random sometimes, and the day is not going to go as you planned, but to like say that's a gift, not a problem. Sort of like like let your kids jolt you out of your routine and like enjoy what comes from that.
Yeah. So there's a time for scripting and a time for spontaneity.
Yeah. How old are the kids that you teach?
Myself, high school, but I have taught. Like I just came from a job where I was teaching kids anywhere from kindergarten to grade 8. So I've basically taught all over the map, but right now I'm teaching high school.
Okay. That must be very difficult to sort of shift gears that way, like such completely different levels of, just sort of like life.
It definitely was. And my previous job was really tough, I found, because I was teaching music, and I would sometimes, for one part of the day, be teaching kindergarten, and then the next hour I'd be teaching grade 8, and having to shift my language was, I found, extremely difficult, probably the toughest part of the job.
It's interesting that sort of like late in Fred Rogers' life, like he gave a fair number of like the college graduation speeches, and to see like how he was, like he knew that most of the people he was speaking with like grew up on him, but also that they were sort of now like 20 and 21-year-olds, not 6-year-olds, and to see the way he tried to sort of like sort of distill this, like remind them of what he had like told them before, but like in sort of like age appropriate language, like he wouldn't talk to them the same way he did when they were in kindergarten.
For sure. And I find it interesting, like many of his songs I'm drawn to for their message, like What Do You Do with the Mad That You Feel? I know that was a song that was played in the movie. And I actually had a conversation the other day with a student about like, so what do you do when you're angry? And I'm basically trying to ask him a similar question to what Mr. Rogers was asking himself in a lot of his songs, which kind of relates to another question I have. For our current generation right now, I don't know, are you familiar with some of the songs that were on the program? I'm sure you are.
Sure, of
Yeah.
course.
What are maybe two or three songs from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood you feel are very relevant today that the current generation should, I don't know, listen to, but at least appreciate the message?
Oh, I mean, I think almost all of them like endure because they're uh, they're all about just kind of like really like fundamental stuff. Even like there's one song called "Tree, Tree, Tree" that's just about like how trees are great, and like that's as true now as it was then. Sort of like there's there's a few of them that like are more sort of 1950s gender roles than like would be current. But what else do I? What do you do with the mad as you feel is great. There's a song which sort of like makes everyone giggle who isn't like 4 years old, but it's you can never go down the drain. But it's a real thing when you're that young that you're sort of like worried like if I'm in the bathtub, is it possible for like when the water goes, will I go? It just and so like that's as true for a 4-year-old in 2020 as it was for a 4-year-old in 1954.
That was very interesting while reading the book, hearing about or reading about how he actually had a lot of experience with early childhood development and psychology even, and he applied that all at once in the show.
No, I mean, it's one of the thing that just blew my mind when I discovered it was the fact that sort of like he, whenever he could on the show, which was almost all the time, would stage action going from left to right. Sort of when he walks in the door, he's going like from like left to right on your TV screen. The trolley, like as it goes off to the neighborhood of make believe, left to right. Just over and over. He does that. And it was because he didn't want to like drill kids on their like letters and numbers the way Sesame Street did. He felt fairly strongly that what was age appropriate was for children to have like sort of like an emotional grounding rather than to know those things by rote. But he was getting children ready to read. He was sort of just like getting them to the idea that like in the English language, sort of like your eyes go left to right. And so it was just sort of like this fundamental underpinning, but it was something important, and he just sort of like every day in a subtle way would do it again and again.
For sure. Quick question for you. This may be our last question, but what projects, either writing projects or any other projects, do you have next? Are you planning on investigating another person from the past? Are you doing something completely different? What's next for Gavin Edwards?
Well, I don't know what the big next thing is. I've been trying to go out and do more public speaking. I've discovered I really enjoy talking about Mr. Rogers and Bill Murray and other people like in front of crowds, and so when people invite me to come, I'm always happy to show up and do it. And what I've been doing a lot of lately that I really enjoy is I've been writing obituaries for the New York Times, and I believe a few of them have run, but mostly on musicians, like sort of like Dr. John, the New Orleans pianist, for example, and I find it feels like a huge responsibility because sort of like for many people, this is the summary of their life that sort of like the world is going to read, and so I feel like you've really got to get it right, and it's like almost a sort of like moral mission of explain sort of like who these people were to people who don't know them, and sort of sum up like what impact they made on the world while they were alive. But I think this is this deeply honorable thing to do that, sort of like, they live their life. At least I can do is try to, sort of like explain it to people who might not know about it. So I've been doing more of that. I really find that gratifying.
Well, has it, like, that's interesting because I know Fred Rogers was big on that which is personal is universal, and that which we try not to mention about is universal. Has it forced you to reflect on your own mortality and your own life?
I sometimes, that, sort of like, you have the idle thought of, if someone did this for me, sort of like, would I be proud of what it added up to? And, sort of like, and these are, for most people don't get obituaries in the New York Times. Sort of like, you could be a great guy living in the suburbs of Tulsa, Oklahoma, who always shovels the driveway of the old lady living next to you, and otherwise just sort of like makes the life better for everyone around you. But that's not so. I don't think what I need in my life is to focus more on public achievement. I'm very content with and proud of, sort of like what I've done there already. It does make you think, though, that it gives you an extra awareness that, we don't have infinite years on this planet, and so do what you can to like make the world around you better while you're here, because the time will always be here.
Mm-hmm. And that was definitely one of the lessons I got from reading this book. Gavin, thank you very much for coming on.
Ryan, Steve, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for inviting me. It's totally an honor.
Again, thanks to everyone who listened. I hope you learned something from Mr. Rogers' example. And until next time.